Hello, my name is Greg Cochran, and I'm the Executive Vice President at Pilko and Associates. Today, I'm joined by two of our senior executives at Pilko, Larry Schmid, who is the President of Pilko and Associates, and Ziad Al-Labban, who is a Senior Advisor to the Chairman. Both Larry and Ziad will be discussing today executive leadership perspectives of a recent gray paper that we published at Pilko that was written by Mr. Ed Rule, entitled, "It's a Leadership Thing, but You Already Knew That." You may recall that we recorded and had a video about Ed's gray paper about 2 months ago. And the perspective that we took during that time was more from a site perspective. Today, we'll cover it more from an executive leadership perspective. But before we get into that discussion, I'd like for Larry and Ziad to introduce themselves. Then we'll give you a glimpse into their illustrious careers in the energy and petrochemical industry. So Larry, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. I don't know about illustrious, but I'll say that I'm a 35-year veteran. My first 25 were with Roman Haas, and then joined Dow through the acquisition that occurred in 2009. I would say a pretty traditional career in terms of a chemical engineer that started doing plant support work, progressed up through higher roles of operations, site leadership, global manufacturing. Worked in about 10 or 11 different businesses and different models. I had the opportunity to do some interesting things, particularly in the merger and acquisition space. So got a chance to work on really actually three major integration efforts after acquisition. So that's been very, very rewarding. And of course, when I left Dow, I had responsibility for about 70 assets, oversight for about 70 assets scattered around in about 26 different countries. So fair bit of global experience and a very rewarding 35-year career.
Excellent. Thank you, Larry. Ziad, why don't you do the same thing?
Okay, hello everybody. I've had also 35-year experience working with Saudi Aramco. I've worked in the upstream and the downstream side of the business, and done it internationally between stints in Saudi Arabia, in the United States, in the Philippines. And when I started off my career, it was in the upstream side, handling the Ghawar, northern part of Ghawar field, which is the world's largest oil field. And I also worked in Safaniya, which is the world's largest offshore field. And then I moved on to go down into the downstream side of the business. And in that, I was for the last 10 years of my career, I was the CEO of three different ventures of Saudi Aramco. One, Saudi Refining, which is Saudi Aramco's venture in the United States. I was the CEO there. And we actually had a partnership with Shell in a company called Motiva. And Motiva actually is currently the owner of the largest refinery in the United States, in Port Arthur. And after 2 years of working as the CEO of Saudi Refining, I came to Saudi Arabia and I was the CEO of Petroga, which is a 400,000 barrel a day refinery in the west coast of Saudi Arabia that also has a petrochemical facility as part of it. And that was a joint venture with Sumitomo Chemical of Japan. And after that, I spent 5 years as the president CEO of Sadara Chemical Company, which is a joint venture between Saudi Aramco and Dow Chemical of the US. And it's actually, I was there building the facility and putting it on stream between 2012 and 2017. And that facility is the largest facility to ever be built in a single phase in the world for just over $20 billion. And now I'm I'm a consultant working with the Pilko team.
Excellent. Thank you, Ziad. As you can see, both of these gentlemen have an amazing executive leadership career. We specifically chose Larry and Ziad for the, let's say, the diversity, what they portray. Larry's role, if I could kind of summarize it in Dow, certainly the last several years of his Dow career, lots of sites in multiple countries, multiple geographies, and the leadership of needing to drive all those sites to perform. Ziad, over the last 10 years, as you heard him say, CEO and president of multiple joint venture companies. So you've got joint venture parents that you need to work with. You've got growing and brand new entities that you need to develop a culture within to make them successful. So extremely valid and valuable leadership skills here. So Larry, let me start with you. We talked earlier about Ed's gray paper, that it was really, it's a leadership thing, but you already knew that. Ed's focus mainly in that discussion was at a site level, and how do you manage that and drive that at a site level? In your experience, given the acquisitions you've been involved in and the multiple sites around the world, how do senior leaders assess and then drive a culture to the extent that you can to make things safe and reliable? How do you do that?
Sure. Let me take a shot at that, Greg. I think, for the context here, so we talk about, acquisitions that could be, single site or multiple sites around the world, but many acquisitions today, whether it's single site or multiple sites, have likely changed hands a number of times. So what we see is, in the world we're in, different operating cultures, different behaviors relative to what you might expect. And why is that? Because we know that in many cases, organizations or companies haven't driven across that finish line to really fully integrate, management systems and cultures. So having said that, I think it becomes very critical that you do a very early assessment to find out where are those significant gaps, where are those big misalignments relative to what you would expect as you drive towards safe and reliable operations. And that first step, which is critical in that assessment phase, it can't be too big of a bite. It truly has to be one where you work to identify those bigger gaps, because you're not going to be able to solve everything in one shot. I think then what you have to do is just kind of build on a couple more of those and make a couple more points. Is you really got to leverage your resources surgically to address those critical areas that need attention. And I would caution here that when you do that, it's not just the common management system gaps that we see when we do this kind of work. It really involves, doing an assessment of some of the leaders and some of the people. And in some cases where there's a mismatch, it's going to become important to make some adjustments and to make some changes. And then, of course, we don't have time today, but without going through an entire sort of cultural integration plan, I would see the critical next step, for senior leaders to really define, based on what you learn in that early assessment, what are the critical rules of the road that apply to your facilities? What are you seeing rise up as the major gaps that don't align with where you think you should be? That can't be a long list. It's got to be a clear list of the non-negotiables, those where you draw a line in the sand around expectations, opposite, accountabilities. And examples might include things like clear guidance on, how you deal with competing priorities that impact safe operations, high hazard work, how do you deal with management of change, procedure use, all that kind of thing. And so I think you have to find that assessment tool, that framework that allows you to do that well and build that structure in place. I'll say, just a quick advertisement, I think Pilko does have a very good tool here. The Pilko 8 drivers methodology is a great tool that, takes one from assessment to, a clear view where you can see in a nice executive summary where the major gaps are, or where that organization is doing very well. And then it brings you to a very detailed, prioritized implementation plan to close those gaps. So that's probably enough on that one, I think, Greg, just to answer your question.
No, that's a great answer, Larry. You're right. I mean, obviously, Pilko's one of the key tools that Pilko has is exactly that. It's an organizational capability tool that is designed to help identify what are the cultures and the attributes going on. See, Larry talked a lot about how do you assess things, but what are you looking for? What are the attributes of a successful corporate culture?
Okay, from my perspective, the attributes that I would look for, let's first start with defining what is a corporate culture. When somebody tells me corporate culture, what it really is the behavior of the employees of the company. And the question then becomes, well, what are the attributes of the behavior of the employees that you would like to have? And from my experience, I found that the first thing you want is you want employees that work well together as a team. Second, you want employees that communicate well with each other. And thirdly, you want to be able to have trust amongst the employees. And you have to consider these three as the legs of a stool. If any one of them is missing, that stool is going to fall and the company will fail. So they're all equally important. And it is very imperative to be able to have those attributes. It's much easier to set it up in a company that you're starting up from scratch. Case in point, Sabah, we were building a facility. Not only were we building it in the field, but we were also having the opportunity to build the company. It's much easier to build a corporate culture from scratch than it is to try to change it.
I'm going to come back to that point in just a minute because I want to talk about, building it from scratch. What exactly does that mean? So Larry, let me come back to you real quick. You talked a lot about assessing and you talked a lot about, the ways it means you do that, but obviously there've got to be challenges that you occur along the way, things that derail the process you're trying to make, or challenge, maybe it's a headwinds from economics or whatever it may be. So what are some of the more challenging things that you've encountered over your career? And then more importantly, maybe how do you tackle those things, or what are the, how do you overcome those challenges so you can continue to make progress?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, I think to that question, Greg, Ed touched on some of that, I think in his great paper very well. And I'll just amplify maybe a little bit more. I think, as you think about going into an organization where you need to drive change, whether, as Ziad said very clearly, the culture and, recognizing that that's really the behavior of the organization, you have to very clearly articulate what you want to be, what you want to see done differently, or what you want to see improved. In other words, what does good look like? And understanding that change management process is not easy. It's a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of conversations, a lot of time, a lot of coaching. And so to do that, I think that's the very first piece. Some may call that a vision or whatever. I just call it clearly articulating what you want to see differently. And if you don't spend enough time and you don't do that well, what you're going to start to see are things like, and we've seen it, you see passive compliance, you see no real buy-in to the changes that you're driving. You see leaders in the organization not walking the talk. I mean, look, as we look at what we're dealing with in this pandemic, we see many government officials in the US that have not handled the COVID-19 expectations very well. Do as I say, not as I do. You see no real change happening at the front lines, which is really what you want to see. It becomes business as usual. Employees don't feel heard. I could go on and on. The performance metrics are not heading in the right direction. Basically, leaders are not leading. So get that step right. Be very clear about what you want to change. Spend a lot of time communicating and really look at what you need to do to support the organization and driving that. I think in some organizations, what I would say is we see leaders recognizing that they have to clearly articulate where they want to go, the vision, where they want to drive the culture or the behaviors, which is good. But that vision is not clear. It's too broad, it's fuzzy, it's fluffy. It doesn't mean anything to the organization. And really, nothing improves. People don't really understand. They get frustrated because somebody's talking to them about change, but they don't know what's really changing. They see things just pretty much the same. And in some larger organizations, I would say it becomes even a bit more challenging because as we've learned, quite a bit, not just in the last year, but many organizations are dealing with initiative overload. It's very common. And trying to drive culture change in an organization where you have all that stuff happening at the same time, if you're not very clear, it's just not going to work. So I think leaders have to be, particularly in those initiative overload situations, you have to be very clear, and you're going to have to ruthlessly prioritize around how you help the organization focus and how you can drive, the change that you're looking for so that needle can be moved in a positive direction. One thing I will say in closing and to this question, Greg, is that, look, when you drive culture change, and I'm not suggesting that every leader needs to be changed, but it's very difficult to drive culture change with the same leadership slate that's been in place in the prior organization that gave you the results that you may not like. So I think you have to really look carefully at which leaders can help carry you forward and which ones, may be better off doing something else.
Tough decisions, but yeah, you're right. You got to find that champion, those champions. Ziad, I'm going to ask you a trick question. You talked about in Sadara starting from scratch, and that you can build your own culture because you're there, you're the leadership on the ground, your team, as you mentioned, is driving in the same direction. So that's probably, I don't want to say easier, but that's one way of doing it. But you've also come into an organization in your career where you've now got to change the culture that already exists. Can you talk about that? What would you need to do in order for a company, in a company like that, in order to drive the change that you really want to have or have to make things successful?
As Larry mentioned in answering his question just now, you need to know where you want to be. And that's very important, that you have to understand that you do have an issue and you need to identify where those gaps exist. And you also need to get the buy-in of the fellow team members, whether it be your peers, your subordinates, or your superiors. Everybody needs to be on board to understand that there is a need to change. And you need to also assess where you stand. So that if you decide that you're at point A and you want to go to point B, then it becomes a question of, well, from going from point A to point B, what is the environment that you're working in? And what are the behaviors of the people that you're working with? And at the end of the day, you have to basically identify the things that are imperative to get done. And you assign them to different leaders because, again, as Larry was mentioning, your leadership and your management needs to walk the talk. They need to be the ones driving this change. That change is not going to happen because somebody writes a letter and says, we're going to change and this is what we're going to do. No, it has to be driven. That means there has to be interaction and between the leadership as well as the rest of the team members. And it is imperative, and it's much more difficult actually to do, especially when a company has been successful. And the way, if you have a successful company, the way that you can get them to change is to actually depict what a crisis will look like in the future if they don't change. So you bring that, you take them 20 years into the future and you tell them, let's do some scenario planning. And you say that 20 years from today, you're going to be in a situation which may not be good. then you ask them, well, how did you get here? And then you take them back. And that will sometimes work with leadership that is not willing to change. When you take them into an area and a space where they say, okay, it wasn't us that brought us here, but now let's see, how did we get here? And you have them play act the scenarios to try to see what changes need to take place. And that's one of the ways that I was able to use in two of the different ventures where you actually say, you know, you're doing a great job. However, this will not get us to where we want to be. And if we don't do something about the way we operate, then we are going to run into a problem. And you backtrack, but it's very important to actually make it, as we called it in one of the companies that I worked for, imperatives. You give an imperative to each one of the senior leaders and you say, your job is to work on this particular attribute, whether it be teamwork, communication, or any of the other attributes or behaviors we want to work on. And you say, this is going to be your job, and you're going to report back to the management and the company once a month on how you've progressed in changing this attribute.
So Ziad, one of the complications I know you faced in some of the JVs that you were CEO over had to do with the parent companies. Can you briefly tell us about, are there idiosyncrasies of parent company relationships that you need to drive? Do they want to push their culture on the JV? I've heard you talk about establishing your own culture within the JV. So can you speak a little bit about that dynamic between parents and the company itself?
Yeah, one of the areas where joint ventures I've seen that don't do well is when there isn't an agreement between the parent companies of the joint venture on the corporate culture that they want to drive. And that becomes a serious problem, because if you had two joint venture partners and both of them are successful, and they can be very large companies of over 50,000 employees. And when you've got a joint venture that's 3,000 to 4,000 employees, you don't want to burden that company with the same kind of cultural bureaucracies which work for large companies, but may not work for very small, nimble, flexible companies. So that's where you need to be able to sit down with your joint venture partners and tell them, listen, you guys are great in doing in these large corporations and dealing business at the level that you're dealing with. But in the smaller JVs, you need to be able to get buy-in from the parent companies of the kind of corporate culture that you're going to develop in this joint venture. It's imperative that that gets done from the very beginning. Otherwise, you're going to have two corporate cultures that may be clashing with each other and will cause potential misalignments within the joint venture and will create problems within the workforce. We say, which way are we going to go? Are we going to go with parent A, or are we going to go with parent B? Yep. And what I've learned is you basically have to tell them, you're not going with A and B, you're going with a culture that works for the size and the job that we're doing in this new company that we've got. And it is imperative to get the buy-in of the parent companies when you're doing that, if you want to be able to succeed.
Makes sense. Get that up front. And that's experience talking right there. You've been there, done that. Larry, you've done the same thing on the acquisition side, where you're acquiring something maybe a bit smaller that doesn't have the resources that they need, and you need to integrate them into your leadership culture. Anything that you would add to what Ziad just said?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, for me, I think you have to really spend the time. It's very difficult in this environment that we're in, but the whole culture change process is very slow. It's not sometimes as fast as we would like it to be. And I think that, what we call it, being on the shop floor as much as you can. So if you've got a large network, obviously getting out to sites, visiting, talking with people, I think is very, very important. It gives you a sense as to whether or not you're actually seeing that needle move in a positive direction, what adjustments you need to make. And more importantly, just talking and listening to people and understanding what their concerns are as you try to go through that change process. Many times we go through this in integrations, and it's really a one-way street communication wise. We don't get the flow of information back the other way. So I think it's very important to strike that balance.
Yeah, great point. You've heard a lot of discussion today from leaders of leaders. These two gentlemen have been, as we started this conversation this morning, they have been leaders, global leaders of a network of leaders. Change management begins with them, and you heard them talk about that. The culture that they're trying to drive, that is their number one priority, or has been, it sounds like, in the roles that they've had. If you would like to know more about what we've talked about today, should you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to contact us. You can reach us at www.pilko.com, or you can simply respond to this email. Hey, Larry mentioned COVID in some of his earlier answers. We truly hope that you and your family are safe and healthy during this time. We'd like to thank you once again for joining us this morning. Take care.